Thank you very much, Kevin. And hello to all of you. Thank you very much for coming. It's obviously an achievement that you've got nothing better to do on a Saturday morning than come and listen to me. So you must have very empty lives, but well done. I shall be talking today about toleration, as Kevin and Alistair said, and just to give you an indication of what I have in mind. I'm going to start by saying something about, I'm going to introduce with a couple of examples, contemporary examples, about what I mean by toleration or tolerance, how it's distinguished from respect, which is the thing that it's typically opposed to. I'll say a little bit about the intellectual history of the concept, or at least the part of its intellectual history that matters to me and that I think is important in this context. And then I'm going to say something about some contemporary applications of the idea. So the idea of tolerance, which in some ways, and perhaps to this audience, seems obvious and natural, is in fact neither, as history has shown. And one of the things I guess I do want to get across, if nothing else, is how fragile it is and how important it is that we be active in thinking about and defending it. I'll start then by just giving a couple of examples. You may be familiar with one or both of these, to illustrate the difference between tolerance or toleration, as I understand it, and as it's understood in this debate, and attitudes like respect, which is a concept that seems to be being used more at the moment. So one example is, if you go back to 2005, this was an episode when there was a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten, which published an article called The Face of Muhammad. And in that article, there were 12 cartoons and an explanatory text. The editor of the newspaper wrote the following: "Modern secular society is rejected by some Muslims. They demand a special position, insisting on special consideration of their own religious feelings. It is incompatible with contemporary democracy and freedom of speech, where one must be ready to put up with insults, mockery, and ridicule. It is certainly not always attractive and nice to look at, and it doesn't mean that religious feelings should be made fun of at any price, but that is of minor importance in the present context. This is the editor of the newspaper. We are on our way to a slippery slope where no one can tell how the self-censorship will end. That is why this newspaper has invited members of the Danish Cartoonists Union to draw Muhammad as they see him." And then there was a sequence of 12 cartoons depicting Muhammad as the prophet of Islam. That in itself is forbidden, at least by some Muslims. You're not supposed to depict him. Also, some of them were certainly, I think, offensive wouldn't be too strong a word. So one of them, for instance, there was a picture of Muhammad, and there were these sort of jihadists who had died coming up to heaven, because they'd blown themselves up. And he said, "Stop coming, we've run out of virgins." So that's obviously, you can see how powerful something like that is. So as a result of this, there were riots all over the world. About 200 people died, possibly more. Since then, in the 15 years since that happened, more people have died. There have been repeated death threats against the people who published this. A number of others who have, following that, published cartoons mocking Islam have been killed, most notably in 2015, what happened in the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, where a government, I think, killed about 30 people in their editorial offices. Second example, this is another religious example. This is another religion. So this is an example to do with works of art. So there was an exhibition, this is in Buenos Aires in 2014, I think. There is an exhibition called Barbie, the Plastic Religion. And this is an exhibition involving Barbie dolls. If you're not familiar, there are these sort of dolls that children play with, where there's like this lady called Barbie and her husband or boyfriend or something called Ken, doing various sort of activities, like being a doctor and a nurse or in the army or whatever it is. Anyway, this exhibition was called Barbie, the Plastic Religion. And in this, the artists featured 33 sculptures of the dolls transformed into religious figurines. So Barbie was as the Virgin Mary, for instance, or Barbie as Joan of Arc. And I think the one that really got people worked up was when Ken was portrayed as Jesus and actually being on the cross, being crucified. The artists were threatened by Catholic groups that were going to come on the day of the opening and smash it up, and as a result, the exhibition had to be cancelled. What both of those examples illustrate, I think, is the difference between two attitudes. One of them is what you might call disrespect, and the other one is what you might call intolerance. So there's no doubt that in both cases, the things that were being produced, the cartoons in one case, the art exhibition in the other case, were intended to be disrespectful towards religion. Indeed, that was the point. That is to say, mocked it, ridiculed it, tried to criticize it through a sort of humorous or quasi-humorous way, but in a way that really showed no concern for the feelings of the adherents of that religion. And indeed, perhaps the point was in part to upset them. In the Danish case, I think that was explicit. The response illustrates not disrespect, but intolerance, because the response by the religious groups that opposed these publications wasn't simply to argue against it or to mock them in their turn or even to ignore it, as some people do, but actually to stop it from happening. So in the case of the Islamic cartoons, it was through the most violent and forceful means possible, that is by actually killing the people who did it. And in the case of the Catholic Church in Argentina, it was through threatening to, I don't think they threatened to kill anyone, but they were going to come and smash the thing up. And there may well have been violence. So in both cases, we have a threat of violence, and as a result, through that intolerant behaviour, we have something being shut down. Now, the point, is, as I say, is to illustrate the difference between these two attitudes, respect and tolerance, or rather the absence of them, the absence of respect and the absence of tolerance. I'll come back to some more contemporary examples in a little while, but I'm going to say a bit now about the history of the distinction, or at least the most important episode in the history of the distinction. And that is really a single work, which if you haven't read, you should read it, by the philosopher John Locke. And this was a work called an essay called Letter Concerning Toleration. So this was a letter which he didn't intend for publication, written in about 1685. The background to it is that, of course, England at the time was coming towards the end of, though people didn't know it at the time, it was coming towards the end of about 150-year convulsion, which really shaped the history of this country. From, if you can date it, I suppose, to the start to when Henry VIII left the Roman Church, so in 1534, all the way up until the Revolution of 1689. And during that period, England was torn apart by wars that centred around religious conflict. So essentially, there were conflicts between the Reform, the Protestants, and the Roman Catholic Church, and those who wanted England to remain in the Roman Catholic Church. There were disagreements not only about the political arrangements, but also about matters of doctrine. For instance, Catholics believe in transubstantiation, so that when you drink wine, it turns into Jesus' blood, and so on. And of course, Protestants don't. So these are obviously connected, and at the time were obviously connected in everyone's mind with the most important things in their lives, because of course it was a matter of your own salvation. What was going to happen to you after you die. The most important questions in your life were connected with religious questions. Deep disagreement over these. This resulted in wars that tore England to pieces between those periods. Not just wars, persecution as well. Of course, we know from when Queen Mary was queen, we know all about the persecutions of the Protestants. Something similar had happened in Europe. I imagine per capita the most bloody war in European history was the war that took place 1618 to 1648. And again, this is a religious war, the 30 Years' War, that was fought across the territory of what is now Germany. So it was something that had torn apart Europe and England, and was in everyone's mind, was religious disagreement. And what Locke proposed was that the attitude that we should be taking to these questions, which he called toleration, was one where it can be legitimate to think that others have got completely wrong, misguided views about matters of the greatest importance to them and to you, and yet still not want to suppress those views. Okay? So that we can tolerate other people's views, even if we don't, as I would now say, don't respect them, even if we think they're completely wrong and indeed pernicious. One of the reasons why Locke held this, of course, was because, he gives various arguments in the letter. One of them, he says, is that when it comes to matters of your own salvation, so really important religious matters, you can't control somebody else's beliefs by force. Neither the state nor any individual agent can, through violence or threat of violence, actually change what somebody else thinks. At best, you can change what they say, you can get them to dissemble, but you can't actually change what anyone else thinks. So having laws, for instance, which govern what people think, which prevent the practice of the belief in certain religions, is ultimately futile. The second argument is that religious beliefs and practices typically don't affect others if allowed to persist unabused. So that if I have my belief about my own salvation, or how I want to pursue my life, and you have yours, my own practice doesn't affect yours, and yours doesn't affect mine. We can each pursue our own, and it's not the state's business to try and stop me from practicing or pursuing my belief, even if it's different from yours or from that the person who runs the country, happens to hold. A third argument, which is perhaps more practical, was, again, based on Locke's own experience, which is that the thing that makes minorities violent, he noticed, was not that they are minorities, but that they feel that they're being oppressed. So that for Locke, the cause of civil dissent was as much the presence of oppression by the state as it was the mere fact that there's disagreement over matters of religion or anything else. And he himself had seen all of those persecutions at first hand and had suffered from them. So for those and various other reasons, Locke promoted a limited form of tolerance in which, for not the first time, but it was very rare, the state permitted a very wide range of beliefs on religious matters and indeed on other philosophical matters without attempting to control or suppress anyone's particular beliefs. So that was toleration and is consistent with the highest degree of disrespect, scorn, and dismissal of the contents of those beliefs themselves. I do want to try to get across, maybe it's something that seems natural now, but I do want to get across what a revolutionary idea it really was, because, of course, it's a natural thing in some ways to think that if, on matters of great importance, beliefs are dangerous. People shouldn't be having these beliefs, because it affects not only them, it may affect others as well, but it's your duty just to try to suppress them. So by urging the limitation of interference with others, so as not to include their beliefs, their expression of their beliefs, Locke was actually proposing something very new. And now, as I say, it seems natural, but in a way that's a measure of his influence on thought at the time and subsequently. I'll say a bit now about some examples, I suppose, of how this applies today. I've already talked about some examples, maybe some examples of how it applies today, which also illustrate the ways in which the debate is perhaps still live in a way that's I find somewhat disturbing. One example would be, and this is a recent example of the University of Bristol. So this was the case of a university lecturer, professor in law called Stephen Greer. This was a lecturer who'd been given the same course for about 15, 20 years. In that course, which was on China, Islam and the Far East, he discussed Islam, he discussed Sharia law and other things, and he said, amongst other things, that Sharia law treats women badly. I believe he talked a little bit about the prevent legislation, and he was, let's say, in some ways critical of Islam. There was a complaint made against him. There was a letter, I think, signed by about 4,000 people. There was a complaint made against him that he was Islamophobic and that Bristol ought to take action, up to and including sacking this person. Bristol University launched an investigation. After months and months, he was exonerated, so it found that there was no Islamophobia. There's no reason to sack him. But Bristol insisted that his course be restructured so that it not cover that material, so that he couldn't continue to teach about Islam, he couldn't continue to teach about Islam in the way that he had been before. And in its statement, it said it's doing this out of respect for religious sensitivities. So this is a clear case, I think, where university authority has suppressed somebody's speech, indeed the speech of an academic, which was for pedagogical purposes, on the grounds that it is concerned with, not merely with tolerating, but with respecting the views of others, and in this case, the deeply felt religious sensibilities of others. Nobody denies that the religious sensibilities of the people who complained, Muslims and others, were deeply held, and that they may well have been hurt by what was said. The issue is whether, in that particular case, we really should be balancing things in such a way that concern for respect outweighs concern for what I regard as the purpose of a university, which is free inquiry and discussion of really important matters, disagreement over which is bound to create hurt feelings and distress. Another example from my own university is when my Cambridge University tried to introduce a policy about a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, where you could be disciplined or sanctioned for the use of what are called microaggressions. And microaggressions are where you say little things that are disrespectful to people and might be hurtful. You may not notice it, it may be a pattern, but it's speech that's perfectly legal, but which people find offensive or difficult. Now, obviously, some of this is just connected with common courtesy, and I can understand why it's just it's simply common sense. But some of it isn't so closely connected with it. Some of the examples that Cambridge gave included stereotyping someone's religion, but also another example would be the choice of pronouns. So that if you use pronouns for someone which are not the pronouns that that person has chosen for themselves, that is, as they put it, pronouns that are not in accordance with their own gender identity, as it's called, that would have counted as a microaggression. Now, I think this perhaps is an example that's got the most modern resonance. I mean, certainly talking to my own children, it's the one that they engage the most with, because it's an interesting question whether using the pronouns of someone someone who identifies as X and you use Y pronouns, for instance, is that merely disrespectful, or is it something worse? Is it discriminatory or harassment, or is it something that university ought to be in the business of stopping? My own sense is that there are philosophical positions according to which you reject concepts like gender identity, for instance, and that there are philosophers, gender-critical feminists, and so on, whose position they regard as, whose position, an important expression of it is that they do indeed use pronouns as they see fit and not necessarily defer to the wishes of the person whose gender identity has been changed insofar as they believe in that concept. So in that case, I think, what happened last year was that Cambridge University withdrew it. There was a bit of a fight and Cambridge University withdrew it, so that didn't happen. Other universities do have these sorts of policies in place. And I think actually gender pronouns is a very good example of a case where if you think about the difference between respect and tolerance, you have quite a sharp, it seems to me quite a sharp distinction, because it can certainly be disrespectful to somebody if you're not using their pronouns, okay? But it's not intolerant of them. You're not denying their right to exist. You're not denying, you're not saying that they shouldn't use those pronouns for themselves. You're simply refusing to use it yourself, and it might be in defense of a particular position, and that's more important to you than the feelings of the person that you're talking about. So I think this is one of the areas where there's going to be increasing, there have been, as you know, lots of fights about it in universities and in other contexts. I think it's going to be one of those areas where there will be increasing dispute, and I think that the important principles that we should hold on to when we navigate these sorts of discussions is the distinction that we get from Locke, which is the distinction between the idea that, on the one hand, you can say things that are disrespectful because they hurt people's feelings, but that's quite independent of whether the state or university, any regulatory authority or university or your employer ought actually to be regulating that speech, particularly in a context such as a university, school, other educational contexts, where what matters is actually questioning these things, because they are subject of, I believe, legitimate philosophical disputes. In conclusion, then, I guess I do want to emphasise, the one thing I do think I want to emphasise is just that 1689, which is the date of the publication of the Letter Concerning Toleration, I think can reasonably be marked as the start date of an almost, a unique and supremely important episode in the history of the world. So what you might call the liberal experiment, that is to say, something which had never really happened since Neolithic times. The idea that instead of imposing opinions on people, instead of suppressing speech and imposing the kind of speech that you believe in, we actually allow a society to flourish, a society in which all kinds of views flourish, whether or not you agree with them, and can be disputed. That led in time to a world where new ideas were welcomed, innovations were created, and what began in England in the late 17th century, then spread across Europe, and now is spread across the world, is, a 330-year-old experiment, which has been part of a process that's created, unparalleled wealth and well-being and prosperity. If you compare the changes in the world in the last 300 years compared to the entire, 150,000 years before that, it dwarfs it. But is for that reason also possibly an exceptional period and a fragile thing. And I think one of the things we're seeing, to my great concern, even in this country now, is just how fragile is that revolution that Locke began, and how it's really up to all of us, if you care about it the way I do, to think about ways to defend it. Thank you very much.